Maybe, but I'm going to say that God came up with it long before Nike came up with it. So how about that?
Amen.
That's right. So, for the summer, we're doing something that I occasionally do, especially around the holiday season, and that's turn to the lectionary. I like the lectionary because if you're aware of it, it helps you cover the major themes in the scriptures over a 3-year process. And I really appreciate the lectionary, especially around Christmas and Easter, because I don't know if you guys know this, but that comes around every year. And it's not always easy to have something fresh or exciting when those times roll around. I didn't know if you knew that or not. In fact, I remember going to church as I was growing up and thinking, boy, it's Easter, it's Christmas, it sounds like I just heard these. Anybody else ever have that experience? You don't have to raise your hand. You do not have to. Well, we're always honest, right? You just don't have to be, perhaps, that forthcoming this morning. Boy, I am doing something I don't ever do.
You're looking up the index.
I am looking up the index. You know, normally I am so good at catching this beforehand. I didn't do it this morning. You know the problem? We're in a text that we don't often preach from. Ezekiel. I should have given you time to do this too. But you know what? I'm going to be there, and you're going to be looking to find it, so it's okay. Ezekiel chapter 2. We already pulled from the Gospel of Mark chapter 6 with Jesus sending the disciples. And whenever Jesus sent the disciples, their tendency was to go pack what they needed to go do ministry, right? We can relate to that. Ezekiel has a little different scenario. In fact, what we hear from Ezekiel is a really different kind of excuse, and it's Ezekiel chapter 2 all the way up through chapter 3, verse 3. But what we start to see is a very common theme. And then the third lectionary reading for today comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And you may not know that reference right off the bat, but if I talk to you about the thorn in the flesh, Paul's thorn, you know that. And that's the reference for that. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 12. All 3 of these passages have things in common. And the main thing they have in common are the excuses that are easy to come up with whenever God calls us to do something. And we are good at creating excuses. I didn't realize how good we were at creating excuses until I had kids. I have never sat down with them and helped them develop excuses. I have never sat down and tried to explain to them the purpose of excuses and when you use them. They seem to know. And the older they get, the more elaborate their excuses are. Everything from, I can't put that away because I'm tired, to, I can't move because I'm hungry, or, I can't take a bath. What was that one? I can't take a bath because of something. Because the sun was still up or something. It's crazy. And I think about that and I laugh and I'm like, you know what? I'm pretty good at excuses myself. I'm pretty good at making excuses as to why I can't do things, or let's be honest, why I don't want to do things. And I thought just to make it fun, I would Google top excuses for not going to work. I've got a few for you this morning. The first, and this is probably my favorite, at least one of my favorites. I broke my arm reaching for a sandwich. Depending upon your job, you may not be able to go. I broke my arm reaching for a sandwich. How about I got stuck under the bed? The universe told me to take a day off. This one, I don't think I'm ever going to have to worry about, but it was reported, and this was actually another employee used this one. My wife found out I was cheating, so I'm spending the day retrieving my belongings from a dumpster. I don't ever plan on that one, so I don't ever plan to use that one. This one makes me a little nervous. My grandmother poisoned me with ham. I don't have to worry about the next one. I poked myself in the eye while combing my hair. My wife put all my underwear in the washer. What? That's the next one. My wife put all my underwear in the washer.
Oh,
no, it doesn't.
That's what it sounds like.
Oh, no. My wife put all my underwear in the washer.
Okay.
So, essentially, the person has no underwear. How about the meal I cooked for the department potluck didn't turn out well? I do like this next one. My doctor said I needed more vitamin D, so I went to the beach. Don't know how this happens, but I suppose it's possible. My cat is stuck in the dashboard of my car. I'm sick because I chugged a bottle of Listerine thinking it was Gatorade. All right, the next one is maybe right up there too. I was kicked by a llama and have a broken leg. And finally, my parakeet has the flu. I need to stay home and take care of it. Those are not bad excuses, right? They're pretty funny. And if we were to be honest, we've probably given some whopper excuses too. Lots of reasons for not doing things. Maybe it's not just work. Maybe it's for not helping around the house. Maybe it's for not cutting the grass. Maybe it's for not helping our neighbor. Maybe it's for not helping a stranger that we didn't even know. It's really, really easy to come up with excuses as to why we're not going to do something. And so with all of this talk of excuses in mind, let's look at the scriptures. Let's look at Ezekiel chapter 2. And this is Ezekiel's call. God is calling Ezekiel to go serve. And so God said to me, Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you. As he spoke, the Spirit came into me and raised me to my feet, and I heard him speaking to me. He said, Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their fathers have been in revolt against me to this very day. The people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and stubborn. I know some people like that. Let's be honest. That's been us too. That's been me. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. And whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are a rebellious house, they will know that a prophet has been among them. And you, son of man, do not be afraid of them or their words. Do not be afraid, though briars and thorns are all around you, and you live among scorpions. Do not be afraid of what they say or are terrified by them, though they are a rebellious house. You must speak my words to them, whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious. Are you noticing the theme of Israel here? Yeah, they're not in a real good spot. But you, son of man, listen to what I say to you. Do not rebel like the rebellious house. In other words, no excuses, Ezekiel. None. Don't be like this. Listen to what I say to you. Open your mouth and eat what I give you. Then I looked and I saw a hand stretched out to me. In it was a scroll which he unrolled before me. And on both sides of it were written words of lament and mourning and woe. And he said to me, Son of man, eat what is before you. Eat this scroll, then go and speak to the house of Israel. So I opened my mouth, and he gave me the scroll to eat. Then he said to me, Son of man, eat this scroll I am giving to you, and fill your stomach with it. So I ate it, and it tasted as sweet as honey in my mouth. It's a pretty tough passage. Be honest, as you read this, how many of you would want Ezekiel's job? Go into people that aren't going to like what you say. And I love when the scriptures say things like, do not be afraid. Because do you know what our tendency is in that situation? To be afraid. By the way, does it work well? When someone says to you, oh, don't be afraid. Does that help you? It doesn't help me either. And I've learned over the years that if somebody is really nervous and anxious and worried, and I say to them, just relax, it doesn't work either. Those aren't things that we are always very good at doing. And normally, when we are afraid, or normally when we're scared, or normally when we're worried, we want to run. The last thing we want to do is to stay and work through this. And in the case of Ezekiel, he wanted to do exactly what he was being called to go preach against. He was being sent to tell the Israelites what they are doing wrong, to call them back. And they were not going to look forward to it. How many times do we read in there whether they listen or they fail to listen? What are you expecting them to do? Not listen. How many of us like to just waste our breath? We don't. And I have now a much better appreciation for that as a parent. The times that we say things over and over and over and over. And I don't know, maybe your kids didn't do this, but mine do this. They look at me like, were you talking? Did you say something to me? Did you really mean me? Yes, I really meant you. I really meant you're supposed to do this. And I think in this moment, that's exactly where Ezekiel is with God. Are you sure? Do you know what you're asking? Do you really mean me? But what I love here is that already we start to see some obedience out of Ezekiel. Because when God says, take what I'm about to give you and eat it, Ezekiel does exactly that. And what he's beginning to see, whether he holds to that the whole time or not, is at least he sees in that moment how sweet God is when we are obedient. How good that is, and how good the Scriptures can be if we are willing to follow them and to live this out and to really put our trust in God. One of the first takeaways today from all three of our lectionary passages is that when God calls, excuses are easy. When God calls, excuses are easy. Ezekiel had a lot of reasons for excuses. We listed some of them. And most of us say, I don't really like public speaking. It's one of the things that I've learned over the years. Most people are really glad that someone else is up here other than them. The only time that's an exception is in a room full of preachers. That's the only exception. Every now and then you'll get somebody that really likes to be up front, but for the most part, people are really glad that it's not them up there having to do it. And so when we think of Ezekiel being called out to share this message with the Israelites who are being described as rebellious and not listening and going the wrong direction, going away from God, that does not sound like a very fun challenge. In fact, it doesn't even sound like a possible successful mission. Most of us don't like setting out to do something when we don't think we're going to have a positive result. I was talking with Raymond about going fishing. Do you know why I like to go fishing? Because I like to catch fish. And when I go fishing, I try to fish in places where there are fish to be caught, right? And if the fish aren't working, guess what I do? I move. I go somewhere else. I try and find a spot where the fish are biting. Because if I'm going to set out to do something, I want to see it happen. Guess how many sermons I preach when there's nobody in the room? One. I recorded one a couple years ago. That was it. But I guess I had a video person in the room. Brian was here with me that day and we recorded it. But it was really tough to preach with nobody else here. So when you're not here, Monday through Friday or Monday through Saturday at 10 o'clock, I'm not standing up here preaching. Never thought about that before, did you? When we go to do something, we expect there to be some sort of result, some sort of positive outcome. And when we think that the outcome is going to be negative or indifferent, or we think we might encounter a lot of problems, that's when the excuses start to fly. And so when God calls, excuses are easy. For Paul had lots of different reasons for excuses, and the one that he mentions in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 is the thorn. And imagine how easy it is to say, God, I can't really do this with this problem. God, you fix me, then I'll do this for you. Don't we? We do that, don't we? You know, God, I can't do this right now because. Well, that sure sounds like an excuse. God, I can't handle this right now. If you fix this problem, then I can do it. Sure sounds like an excuse. And with the disciples, it was stuff. Be honest, how many of us head off on a journey without having some plan of where we're going, without taking an extra set of clothes with us, without taking money with us. You may have laughed at my suitcase full of stuff, but I packed stuff like that for vacation just in case. And some of you know this, that when I was in between college semesters and traveling home from Florida to Pennsylvania, my way of packing was backing the truck up to the window and tossing stuff out just in case I might need it. I've been there. It would have been really tough for me to do what Jesus told the disciples that day. Go with nothing. Makes it a whole lot easier to travel, a lot less to carry, a lot less to worry about, but it's pretty scary. And so there are lots of different reasons for excuses. Whether we don't like the possibility of the outcome, whether we don't like where we're going, whether we don't think we have enough stuff, whether we think we have some sort of limitation or something that is going to interfere personally, all comes down to excuses. The second thing that we take away from these passages, and this I think you have to look just a little harder to see because it's not as in front. It's not as obvious that when God calls, it's an opportunity for worship. We don't think about much like that because we often think music is worship. But really, worship is so much more. Music is worship, but worship isn't just music. Do you understand the distinction? What we do on Sunday mornings is all worship, but the way we live the rest of the week is also worship if we're responding to God. And so in these moments where God is reaching out or where Jesus is connecting with the disciples and calling them to go, these are opportunities for worship because God and that person are connecting. And there is this divine instruction, this teaching, this calling for Ezekiel. He's actually called to stand to his feet in the presence of the Holy One. We don't think much about that, but right at the beginning of chapter 2, stand up, O Son of Man. Right at the beginning, stand up and worship in this. For Paul had been depending upon God's grace. And the answer that he receives in chapter 12, do you remember what it is? My grace is sufficient. When Paul says, if you would remove this, 3 times God's answer is, my grace is sufficient. That's an opportunity for worship. Because God is reaching out and saying, no matter what you are doing, no matter what you think your limitation is, no matter what you think your reason is for not doing this, I will help you do it. And when we are connecting with God, when we are working together, that is worship. There are so many parables that teach us what worship is. As Jesus interacted with people, as Jesus taught the disciples, as Jesus showed others what it meant to minister. And all of these opportunities are worship. The disciples actually worship by being obedient. It's not something that we talk much about in church anymore because we don't really like obedience unless we're the ones that people are being obedient to. We're always honest, right? How many of us like being obedient to others? You? How many of us like being accountable? It's another word for obedience. We don't even like being accountable. We don't enjoy this stuff. Now, we love it when people are accountable to us. And I really want my children to listen better than I'm sure I did as a kid. I have higher expectations for them than I did for me. And then I watch my parents with my children, and I'm like, wait a minute. You don't require the same obedience from them that you did me. And their response is, but it's different. How is it different?
It is.
It is different. I'm not there. I know it's different. But sometimes we look at this, we're like, it feels like the standard changes. But the disciples were obedient to Jesus. And you say, well, how do you know that? Well, I think it's pretty reasonable to take away that had they not listened, I think that would have been recorded in the scriptures. Because every time the disciples got it wrong, somebody wrote it down. I am so glad that I wasn't one of the core disciples some days. Because all that stuff would have been written about us in our own chapters, right? And the third thing that we look at here, when God calls, and I hope you really put this one into practice, when God calls, it's an opportunity to grow. See, I shared that right at the beginning of Ezekiel, that Ezekiel was called to stand. But there's something else that happens with standing. And this was something that has come to light more and more. As the kids are getting older, when they were younger, we did exactly what Gina is doing right now with Elena. By the way, I get to dedicate Elena next week, which is awesome. She is holding her. And Elena is carried everywhere she goes. Right? For good reason. She can't walk. She's not even really rolling over yet. She'll get there. But what happens as kids get older and their walking abilities grow? We make them walk. For a couple of reasons. Number one, they can, and we want them to improve in walking. Number two, they're getting heavy. Allie's on that fence. She still really likes me to carry her, but she's getting heavy. And I don't like to admit it, but there's days that my back is hurt after holding her. When we step out in these moments as God calls us, it forces us to walk in our faith. It forces us to grow. Let's be honest, if somebody carried us our whole life, we wouldn't be able to walk well. Not only would we struggle with the muscle memory to do that, but we would struggle with having enough physical strength to go any kind of distance. We look at people and say, boy, man, their faith is so strong. I wonder how they got there. There was a lot of walking in the faith. My guess is it was a tough road at times too. It wasn't always easy. It wasn't always scrolls that tasted like honey. There was a lot of dealing with people who were rebellious and people who didn't listen, and times that they could have made excuses that they chose instead to be obedient. We don't just wake up one day and be a bodybuilder. You guys love me and I know it, that's okay. Every now and then I get my words mixed up, it's still good. You'll remember it. I'm okay. We don't just wake up one day and we are suddenly Mr. or Mrs. Universe. Whether that's with our physical bodies or that's in our spiritual life as well. Does that make sense? And so when God calls, don't look at it and say, what excuse can I use this time? Look at it and say, God, show me, help me follow you so that I can grow in this opportunity. And for Ezekiel, as he was called to the feet, this was his opportunity to really stand and to move and to go. For Paul did so much for planting the New Testament church. We often think of the letters that Paul sent to the churches, but Paul traveled. Paul was all over the place. And for his time, that was an anomaly. Not everybody traveled the way Paul traveled. When we think about jumping in the car and we take off and go, no big deal. Or we get in a plane and go, and I shared in a couple of weeks, we're flying to Myrtle Beach. It's going to be awesome. We're going to leave Pittsburgh Airport. Hour and a half later, be at the beach. That is perfect. Minimal crying, whining. I promise I'm doing my best for Jen this year. I'm not going to cry anymore. I don't like to fly, but it's amazing that we can leave here and be there in such a short time. We drove it a few times, a good 12-hour drive, 13-hour drive, depending upon how it's going. With kids, it feels like an eternity. But imagine doing it by horseback, or by donkey, or by foot. If we were walking to Myrtle Beach, I wouldn't be going. Seriously, I don't know how long that would even take me. I'm not in the best of shape. I do more riding than walking. And it's going to take a while to get there. And the same thing is true in our life, in our spiritual life. We want the opportunities to just help us grow, help us arrive, help us get there. And so whenever we think that it's going to be a challenge or a difficulty, the temptation is to say, oh God, not today. Well, God, maybe if you tell me that the results are going to be good. Or, well, God, okay, but get those Israelites into shape first. Don't make me work too hard on this. It doesn't really matter what God is calling to you to do. What matters is how you respond. Excuses are easy. Opportunities to worship start to put us in the right frame of mind. And when we become obedient, they help us to grow. So at the end of the day, we can make excuses and stay where we are. But when God calls, we respond and go. This is one of those for me that there is no in between. We either go or we don't. Like Yoda would say, we do what we want. Okay, let's close in prayer. Dear God, thank you for this opportunity. And thank you for this reminder that as we look through the Old Testament, we look into the New Testament, and then we read in the Gospels, God, it is easy to make excuses. God, forgive us for the times we choose excuses rather than you. Help us to follow you more and more on a daily basis. God, help us to worship you, no matter what day it is, no matter what's going on in our life, no matter where we think we could be. And God, remind us of what you did with everyone that we talked about this morning, the way you will be with us, the way you will help us in this journey, just the way you prepared Ezekiel. God, we just pray that you would prepare us as well and help us to follow and to be obedient to you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Hey, a couple of quick